This housing anxiety has turned the great Australian dream into the great Australian nightmare.
The government has withdrawn so far from housing as a policy priority, and therefore from the human right to housing, that the system has failed due to underinvestment, undercare.
Well, Australia's construction sector has warned ambitious housing targets won't be achieved unless there's a massive increase in tradies and key services like roads and power.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones. Welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. This week on the show, we ask, are we about to have an election that's decided on housing, or maybe more accurately, a shortage of it? Housing in Australia is among the costliest in the world, especially in Sydney, where the average home costs more than 13 times annual disposable income. I don't need to tell the renters listening too that those costs have been soaring. Ben Westcott is a reporter who writes about politics for Bloomberg. He's based in Canberra and he joins me today. Ben, great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It does seem like our current cost of living crisis isn't great timing for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his re-election prospects. Before we get into why housing is such a critical issue ahead of the election, Ben, can you lay out some cold hard stats for us?
Well, you hit on it right there in your introduction, where you said that there was a 13 times, that the current housing price is 13 times the average income. And I don't know if your average sort of listener has any idea about how that compares. So let me tell you, back in the day, 50 years ago, that was closer to 4 times to 7 times your average income. That meant that, for the average person, it would only take up to 7 years to pay off their home, whereas now it's 14 years, if not longer, depending on where you buy. And I think that doubling in the amount of time it takes to pay off or the expense of a home has meant that many young people nowadays feel that it's completely outside their reach, any sort of housing long-term security. And that creates economic uncertainty, it creates dissatisfaction among voters, and it does leave parents frustrated for their children as well. So I think that really is a great example of what is behind this housing crisis. But it's not alone. I mean, if you look at the amount of house prices have gone up just in the short period of time over the past year, we're talking 16% in Perth. 16% over 1 year increase in house prices, 12% in Adelaide, 10% in Brisbane. And although they've come off a little bit in the past year or so in major cities like Melbourne, it's still up about 30% at least on how it was before the pandemic. That's enormous increases in a short period of time. And there's, anyone who lives in Australia will happily tell you that their wages have not gone up 30% since the start of the pandemic. So given that, and the fact that rents are also going up at the same speed. During the pandemic, we saw a jump in rents that now are going up by something like 7% every single year. Before the pandemic, they were going up by something like 0.4%. So all these things have come together to create a housing crisis in Australia that is starting to really begin to rankle voters.
So, Ben, you've been doing some investigation into how housing will parlay into an election result, whenever that is. We don't know when the election is going to be. All that we do know is that it's going to be sometime before May 17. What can you tell me, and what do we know so far about how both of the major parties are thinking about fixing the housing troubles if they do get in come election day? Let's start with Dutton and the coalition. What's his plan?
Sure. So there are 2 major housing policies that have been announced by the coalition so far. There may be more before election day, but they focus primarily on getting people into homes and in homes in outer greenfield sites. That's new homes on the outskirts of cities, outer suburban areas. Now, the 2 policies, one of them is that Australians will be allowed to take $50,000 out of their super to buy their first home, and then they'll have to pay it back eventually when they sell the home. But the view of the coalition is that there is more economic security for Australians by allowing them to take $50,000 out of their super and buy a home than by just having a larger superannuation account.
Wait, so they have to pay it back to themselves when they sell the house? Is that how it essentially would work, or...?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so they after they sell the property, 50,000 of that goes back into their superannuation, but they will have lost that accrued interest in the meantime.
And $50,000, I mean, the median house price, at least in Melbourne, where I am, is nearing $1 million. Like, what's 50,000 going to do? What's the thinking there? Is it implied that young people trying to get their foot onto the property ladder are going to have some sort of substantial savings? Surely it can't be just all hinged on that, because it's quite a low amount, isn't it?
Well, 50,000 would be a 10% deposit on a $500,000 house. But I mean, as you point out, in many places in Australia, $500,000 houses are not something that's readily accessible.
They're units, right?
Well, exactly. So the idea is that it would have to be added to a deposit. But something that a lot of people who are critics of this policy say is that many Australians, particularly young Australians, don't have $50,000 in their superannuation account to take out, particularly ones who had to drain their super during the pandemic to pay for everyday things that they needed. So there are definitely critics of that particular policy. The other Dutton opposition policy has been that they will put $5 billion into building out infrastructure to outer city greenfield sites that will allow builders to construct with security, new suburbs without having to worry about the great expenses of building roads out there, building sewerage, power lines, things like that. That would be taken care of by the federal government through that $5 billion facility.
Interesting. Let's have a look at Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his Labor Party. They're keen on the build-to-rent model and other solutions as well, right? Like things like modular housing. Can you step me through some of the plans and the key plan, if he has one, that we know of so far to fix this crisis?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the Labor Party's policy is far more holistic. They want to see housing wherever they can get it. They want to see more high density. They want to see more green fields, but they just want to see more houses in general for people. And one of the options they've turned to is build to rent. Build to rent is a system where Australians would pay a corporate landlord rather than a mum and dad investor to live in a apartment block. Now, this is something that is not uncommon in other countries, but it really hasn't been very much explored in Australia, partly through a dislike of apartment living, particularly in Australian cities. But it's now really taken the country by storm. You've got huge build-to-rent tower blocks going up in major cities like Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, and all these are seen as really important ways to find housing for people who want to live close to services but may not be able to actually afford a full house on their own. In addition to that, the government's also thrown in a bunch of other policies, and they have a large number of sort of policies to address different things, all aimed at an overall housing goal of 1.2 million new homes by 2029. Now, developers I speak to say that they're a bit doubtful of that. It'll be a very difficult target to meet, but they're also encouraged by the fact that there is a target at all. And they say even if you don't hit 1.2 million, 1 million new homes, 1.1 million new homes is a really good target and something that's worth aiming for. Now, the other things they're putting in place are the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is a facility that would allow for investment in small numbers of houses around the country, sort of like an investment fund. And then things like the housing compact with the states, where essentially if states beat their own housing construction goals, they get a bonus for good performance from the federal government. So there's a lot of little bitty policies that the government has put in place to solve the housing crisis.
And is there any sense that either of these two parties' policies are popular with voters? What is the polling telling us?
The one thing the polling does tell us is that Australians are frustrated with the Albanese government and don't see it having taken enough action to combat the housing crisis. And I think the other thing that there's no doubt of is that Australians don't think that this suddenly appeared in May 2022, that they remember that housing prices started to skyrocket in the pandemic and that they've been unaffordable for a long time. I think essentially voters blame both parties for this, but as the current government is the Albanese government, they want to see solutions from it, and they don't necessarily think they've seen that.
Let's keep our finger on the pulse of voter sentiment. Both Dutton and Albanese own property, as do many politicians. Ben, does this make them less relatable to the average person who's, struggling to simply get a rental, or do we just not care?
There was a fascinating moment on another podcast recently that Peter Dutton spoke on, where he talked eloquently about the procedures of selling blocks, splitting blocks, operating inside the housing market. He has a real long history of being a developer, of owning businesses and land. I mention this because I think there is a real ambition among Australians to also have a property portfolio. I think that's why when Anthony Albanese's $4.3 million holiday house at Copacabana was revealed in October last year, while the press gallery in Canberra went into paroxysms over it and were, dominated the news cycle for weeks, average Australians, I think, some I'm sure were furious, but others kind of looked at it and thought, well, I'd like to own a $4.3 million holiday house on the Central Coast one day. And I think there was a real aspirational quality to it, which they quite liked, particularly knowing Albanese's backstory as a working class, public housing kid. So I think that although both Dutton and Albanese are property developers, or are property owners and landlords, and that's something that the Greens political party have picked up on a lot, the fact is that many Australians look at that and they think, I want to be there, help me get there, rather than how dare you.
Hard scrabble upbringing aside, who wouldn't want to live in a place called Copacabana? Pretty cool.
I might just take the $4.3 million, to be honest.
After the break, we'll have a look at how record immigration has exacerbated the housing shortage. This is the Bloomberg Australia podcast.
There's obviously more to the housing problem than population growth, and cutting immigration alone won't solve it. For example, there's the lowest housing approvals in a decade, NIMBYism, the absence of social housing, tax breaks for investors, easy loans sold on commission, Airbnb robbing the long-term rental market. You've got to tackle them all.
Welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. You're with me, Rebecca Jones, and Ben Westcott, Bloomberg's man in the press gallery in Canberra. Today, we're talking all things housing. We just heard there from ABC business commentator Alan Kohler. Ben, when we talk about the housing market, there are a myriad of factors that decide what that market looks like. Immigration being one. Another massive one, of course, is the interest rate. And while we're waiting to see what the RBA is going to do there, I want to ask you about your reporting in the field. You've talked to a lot of developers and those in the construction industry. What is their read on tweaking immigration policy to address this housing shortage?
So just for people who aren't aware, there's been a big boom in post-COVID migration to Australia, and net migration peaked at about 555,000 people in the September quarter of 2023. Now, that's been blamed by the opposition for worsening the housing shortage and a number of other things around Australia, the cost of living crisis. But when you talk to developers, what they say is that they want more migration, and not necessarily people just to live here, but they want more skills in the economy. They want more bricklayers. They want more construction workers. They need electricians, basically every type of skill, because one thing you hear from everyone is that they're incredibly busy. There's never an end to the work, but they could always do with more hands on those sites. And I think that given that Australia is in the middle of both trying to solve a housing shortage and construct massive infrastructure projects in all capital cities, I think no matter where you live in Australia, you will have a giant patch of cranes and cork boards in the middle of your city you look at every day. There needs to be more workers for that. And I think that's something that developers talk about a lot, is needing to solve a skills shortage rather than a migration crisis.
So we've got Peter Dutton on one side with his cashing out super idea, better infrastructure planned for the outer burbs, holding on to the Australian dream that way. Anthony Albanese on the other side, build to rent. That's a complicated idea. It is one that we do see gaining traction, at least on the east coast of Australia. Migration, whichever way you fall on that one, skills shortage is an enduring issue that both sides, no matter who gets in, are going to have to deal with. Before I let you go, Ben, how has housing and affordable issues impacted on other elections around the world in the past year? Can you reassure me, or at least give me some kind of hope?
Well, I think a great example is the US election that's just wrapped up in America, and that saw housing a major issue on the agenda. We heard Democratic candidate Kamala Harris pledging to introduce a sort of John Howard-style first home buyers grant that obviously she wasn't successful, but we've also heard since his election, President Donald Trump talking about needing to restore the great American dream of home ownership. So this is clearly becoming a major issue in America, and it's been an issue in the UK as well, which saw a change of government there. Now, does that mean we'll see a change of government in Australia? Not necessarily, although there is something that would be worrying Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The fact is that Australians are a lot more vulnerable to these interest rate rises because Australians are a lot less likely to have a fixed term mortgage. In the US, some fixed term mortgages can run for decades, whereas in Australia, it's much shorter than that. And in fact, we often have this term, the mortgage cliff, when all of a sudden a bunch of Australians fall off fixed-term mortgages and are at the mercy of the interest rates, the Reserve Bank's interest rates. And as we've seen over the past year, we've had those at a 13-year high, which has made Australians feel more poor and more angry about their situation. So when the Reserve Bank makes its decision in February about what it's going to do with interest rates, it won't just be homeowners and mortgage holders across the country looking closely to see what happens. The government will certainly be keeping everything crossed that Michelle Bullock announces a cut to help its own election prospects.
Poor and angry. Let's hope that not too much more of that in our stars. Great to have you with me, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Ngunnawal people. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you get your podcasts and sign up for Bloomberg's free daily newsletter, Australia Briefing. Go to bloomberg.com to subscribe.